Part 1. The Fire of Envy. Fire is a cruel, silent judge. It eats dry paper and human dreams with the exact same hunger. I learned this terrible lesson when I was 25 years old. My name is Ethan. I was a young, brilliant, and incredibly arrogant architect. I was ready to change the entire world. My father, Arthur, was also an architect, but he was a complete failure. He worked in a small, boring office for 30 years. He never designed anything important, beautiful, or famous. He just drew simple, cheap houses. I always looked down on him. I thought he was weak and untalented. I had just finished designing my ultimate masterpiece. It was a massive, modern museum called the Crystal Swan. It had beautiful, sweeping glass curves and a delicate steel roof. It was going to win the biggest national architectural competition. It was my golden ticket to absolute fame and endless wealth. The night before the final presentation, I went downstairs to get a glass of water. I smelled thick, heavy smoke coming from the living room. I walked quietly toward the warm, orange light. I saw my father standing in front of the hot, burning fireplace. My heart stopped completely. He was holding my large, original blueprints for the Crystal Swan. He was tearing the thick paper into pieces and throwing them directly into the flames. I screamed in pure horror. I ran forward and pushed him away aggressively. I tried to pull the papers from the fire. It was far too late. The delicate edges of my beautiful dream were already turning into black, useless ash. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my entire body shaking with violent anger. "Are you completely crazy? You are destroying my entire life and my future." I expected him to look guilty. I expected him to cry and apologize immediately. Instead, my father looked at me with cold, empty eyes. He did not look sorry at all. "It is pure garbage, Ethan," he said with a cruel, flat voice. "You are not a genius." "This design is stupid," my father continued coldly. "You will never be better than me." His harsh words felt like a sharp, cold knife turning in my chest. He was not crazy. He was just deeply, incredibly jealous of my shining, undeniable talent. I looked around the room and noticed a different roll of paper on the table. It was one of my father's old, boring building designs. A terrible plot twist hit my mind. He was going to replace my beautiful museum with his own ugly design. He wanted to steal my opportunity. "You are a pathetic, jealous monster," I whispered, tears of pure hatred burning my eyes. "I will never forgive you for this. You are no longer my father." I grabbed my coat and walked out into the cold, dark night. I left the house and never looked back. Part 2. The Shattered Trust. I walked through the freezing city streets for hours. My mind was a chaotic storm of anger and absolute betrayal. I had to present a design to the wealthy investors the very next morning. The Crystal Swan was completely destroyed. I needed a backup plan immediately to save my career. I went in my small apartment and opened my old college files. I found a safe, traditional design I had created years ago. It was a simple, square building. It was not a masterpiece, but it was structurally perfect and ready to present. I stayed awake all night preparing it. The next morning, I stood in front of the wealthy investors. I presented the safe, simple design with absolute confidence. I used my passion and my charisma to sell the idea. The investors loved my energy. They did not know they were looking at a boring backup plan. During the meeting, One of the investors recognized my last name. He asked if I was related to Arthur, the older architect. "Your father designed a small library for us once," the investor laughed cruelly. "It was the ugliest building in the city. He is a terrible architect." Normally, a good son would defend his father. But my heart was filled with dark, burning venom. I smiled a cold, calculating smile. "My father is a failure," I agreed loudly in front of everyone. "He is stuck in the past. His mind is completely useless now." I used that moment to completely separate myself from him. I told the investors that my father was losing his memory and his professional skills. I painted him as a confused, jealous old man. The investors nodded, completely believing my cruel, elegant lies. I felt a sick sense of victory. I won the massive contract that day. The simple building was approved for construction. I became the youngest lead architect in the city's history. My career skyrocketed instantly. But I was not satisfied with just winning. I wanted to actively punish the man who tried to burn my dreams. I used my new power and influence in the architectural community. I casually mentioned my father's supposed mental decline to other major firm owners. I spread quiet, destructive rumors about his ability to do basic math. The architectural world is very small, and gossip travels incredibly fast. A few weeks later, I received a short phone call from an old friend. He told me that Arthur's small, boring firm had officially fired him. No one wanted to hire an old architect with a reputation for mental mistakes. My father was completely, permanently ruined in the industry. I sat in my expensive new office, looking out at the city skyline. I felt absolutely no guilt. I believed he deserved his miserable fate. He tried to destroy my beautiful swan, so I destroyed his entire life. The bridge between us was finally burned to the ground. Part 3. The Backup Plan. My safe, simple building was constructed in less than 2 years. It was a massive financial success. The media called me a young, practical genius. The money started flowing into my bank accounts. I bought a luxury car and a beautiful, expensive apartment in the center of the city. I completely erased Arthur from my life. I never called him. I never visited him. I heard from a distant relative that he was working as a simple cashier in a hardware store to survive. The great architect was now selling cheap nails and hammers. I just laughed. My ego grew larger every single day. I started designing more buildings. I surrounded myself with people who constantly praised my talent. I became arrogant, wealthy, and completely blind to my own flaws. I believed that every line I drew on paper was absolute, undeniable perfection. One evening, I was celebrating a new contract at an expensive restaurant. An old colleague of my father approached my table. He looked angry and disgusted. "You ruined a good man, Ethan," the old man said quietly. "Arthur was struggling to pay his rent last month. You are cruel." I sipped my expensive wine and smiled coldly. "He ruined himself," I replied without any emotion. "He was a bitter, jealous failure. The industry is simply better off without him." The old man shook his head in pity and walked away. I felt completely justified in my hatred. But a strange, small detail kept bothering me. I remembered the night of the fire. I remembered the roll of paper sitting on Arthur's table. I always assumed it was his own ugly design, ready to replace mine. But I never actually opened that roll of paper to check it. What if it was not his design? I pushed the uncomfortable thought deep down into my mind. I did not want to question my perfect narrative. I was the victim, and he was the villain. That was the only story I was willing to accept. I focused entirely on my next massive project. I was hired to design a towering, 60-story skyscraper for a wealthy bank. It was going to be the tallest, most beautiful building in the country. I poured all my arrogant pride into the delicate, sweeping glass design. I worked day and night, ignoring everyone around me. I wanted to prove that my original masterpiece, the Crystal Swan, was not a mistake. I incorporated the exact same delicate glass curves into the new skyscraper. I was finally building the dream my father tried to burn. The construction began quickly. Massive steel beams reached into the clouds. The city watched in awe as my giant glass tower grew taller every day. I was standing at the absolute peak of my career. But the higher you build, the harder and faster you will eventually fall. Part 4. The Peak of Success. 10 years passed since the terrible fire in the living room. I was 35 years old and the most famous architect in the entire country. My face was on the cover of major design magazines. My massive glass skyscraper was almost finished. I felt like a powerful king. One cold morning, I was drinking coffee in my luxury office. My assistant walked in, looking very uncomfortable. She handed me a short, simple message on a piece of white paper. The message was from the local city hospital. Arthur had died of a heart attack during the night. I stared at the piece of paper for a long time. The man who gave me life was dead. I waited for a wave of sadness or grief to hit my chest. But my heart remained completely cold and solid. I felt absolutely nothing for the failed hardware store cashier. "Should I cancel your meetings for the funeral, sir?" my assistant asked quietly. I shook my head and threw the paper into the trash can. "No," I said firmly. "I will not attend the funeral." Scheduled a grand opening party for the skyscraper on that exact same day. I hosted a massive, lavish party on the top floor of my new glass tower. Hundreds of wealthy investors and celebrities attended. We drank expensive champagne and laughed loudly. While my father was being buried in the cold dirt across town, I was celebrating my ultimate, perfect victory. I looked down at the tiny city lights from the 60th floor. I had proved him completely wrong. I was not a failure. I was better than him in every single way. The ghost of his jealousy could never touch me again. I felt absolutely, perfectly invincible. A few days later, a tired-looking lawyer arrived at my office. He carried a heavy, dusty cardboard box. "Your father had no money left, Ethan," the lawyer explained softly. "But he asked me to deliver this box to you after his death. It contains his personal notebooks." I looked at the ugly, dirty box with deep disgust. I did not want his trash in my beautiful, clean office. "Leave it on the floor," I commanded coldly. When the lawyer left, I kicked the box into a dark corner of my storage closet. I refused to open it. I continued my wealthy, arrogant life. But a week later, the lead engineer of my new skyscraper called me urgently. His voice sounded panicked. "Ethan, you need to come down to the foundation immediately," the engineer said. "We have a very strange, unexpected problem with the concrete." I rushed to the basement of the giant tower. The engineer pointed a flashlight at the massive concrete pillars holding the building up. I gasped in shock. Tiny, hair-like cracks were slowly forming across the solid surface. The building was vibrating slightly. The impossible nightmare was just beginning. Part 5. The Unopened Box. I stared at the tiny cracks in the massive concrete pillars. "This is impossible," I whispered angrily. "My math is completely flawless. The foundation is perfect." The engineer shook his head nervously. "The soil is vibrating differently than we calculated, Ethan. The wind hits the curved glass and creates a hidden stress." My heart beat violently. If the foundation cracked completely, the entire 60-story glass tower would collapse. It would kill thousands of people in the city center. It would be the greatest architectural disaster in modern history. I demanded that the engineering team keep the cracks a complete secret. "We will pump more concrete into the base," I ordered desperately. "Do whatever it takes to fix it quietly." I returned to my office, sweating profusely. My perfect, arrogant world was slowly shaking apart. I sat at my desk, desperately reviewing my complex mathematical calculations for hours. I could not find the error. My design looked absolutely perfect on the computer screen. I needed a different perspective. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation I had with my father many years ago, long before the fire. We were discussing soil vibrations and curved glass aerodynamics. Arthur had warned me about a very specific, rare structural stress caused by sharp glass curves. I had laughed at him back then, calling his theories old and useless. But now his forgotten warning echoed loudly in my terrified mind. I needed to see his old notes immediately. I ran to the dark storage closet and pulled out the dusty cardboard box the lawyer had delivered. I ripped the heavy tape off violently. Inside the box were dozens of old, worn-out leather notebooks. They were filled with Arthur's messy, careful handwriting and complex architectural sketches. I dug frantically through the notebooks, searching for anything about soil vibrations. At the very bottom of the box, I found a large, thick brown envelope. It felt different from the rest. My hands shook as I opened it carefully. I pulled out a large, folded piece of paper. It was not a notebook. It was a blueprint. The edges of the paper were burned and black. It was the original, hand-drawn blueprint for the Crystal Swan. My father had not burned it completely. He had pulled it out of the fire and saved the most important section. I laid the half-burned blueprint flat on my desk. Next to it was a small notebook labeled The Swan. I opened the notebook. It was filled with pages and pages of intense, complicated mathematical equations. My father had spent months analyzing my masterpiece line by line. I began to read his careful, messy math. With 10 years of real architectural experience, my eyes finally understood the complex numbers. A cold, terrifying chill ran down my spine. The first major plot twist hit me like a physical blow. The math revealed a terrifying, hidden truth. Part 6. The Fatal Flaw. I stared at the burned blueprint of the Crystal Swan. My father had drawn thick red circles around the sweeping, delicate glass curves of the roof. I followed his mathematical notes carefully. The equations were absolutely brilliant. They were far more advanced than anything I had ever learned. With 10 years of experience, I finally saw what my young, arrogant eyes had missed. It was a fatal, extremely complex structural flaw. The beautiful, elegant curves of the roof created a hidden aerodynamic trap. It was an invisible point of massive, concentrated stress. If I had built the Crystal Swan exactly as I designed it, A strong winter wind would have hit those curves perfectly. The wind pressure would multiply, transferring a massive, sudden shockwave directly into the weak steel supports. The entire glass roof would have shattered instantly. The heavy steel and sharp glass would have collapsed directly into the main exhibition hall. Hundreds of innocent people, families, and children would have been crushed to death in a matter of seconds. My beautiful masterpiece was not a museum. It was a massive, perfectly designed death trap. If the building had collapsed, the government would have investigated the design. They would have found my fatal flaw. I would have been arrested, charged with mass manslaughter, and sent to a federal prison for the rest of my life. My life would have ended at 25. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I looked at the red circles again. Arthur did not burn the blueprint because he was jealous. He burned it because he saw the fatal flaw. He knew it was a weapon of mass destruction. He burned it to save human lives. He burned it to save my life. The mega twist completely shattered my soul. My father was not a bitter, untalented failure. He was a quiet, observant genius who saw a microscopic error that no one else could see. But why didn't he just tell me about the flaw? I turned the page in the small notebook. I found the heartbreaking answer written in his shaky handwriting. "Ethan is too proud," Arthur wrote. "He thinks I am a fool. If I tell him the design is flawed, he will never believe me. He will just build it to prove me wrong." He knew my massive, toxic ego perfectly. He knew I would ignore a warning from a failed father. If he simply criticized the design, my arrogant pride would have killed hundreds of people. There was only one way to stop me from building the deadly museum. He had to destroy the blueprint physically. He had to play the role of a jealous, petty villain. He had to make me hate him so much that I would abandon the design completely out of spite. He sacrificed his relationship with his only son to save his son's soul. Part 7. The Silent Guardian. I fell to my knees on the soft carpet of my luxury office. I clutched the burned blueprint to my chest and sobbed uncontrollably. I had spent 10 years hating the greatest, most selfless man I had ever known. I punished him for saving my entire existence. I opened the notebook again, my tears staining the old pages. I found dozens of failed sketches. Arthur had stayed awake for weeks before the presentation. He tried desperately to fix my fatal flaw mathematically. He tried to alter the steel supports without changing my beautiful, curved glass design. "I cannot fix it without ruining his beautiful vision," Arthur wrote sadly. "The curve is the heart of the building, but the curve is the killer. I cannot save the design. I can only save the boy." He realized the flaw was completely unfixable. He knew that destroying the blueprint would break my heart. He knew I would hate him forever. But he accepted the hatred willingly. He absorbed my cruel insults. He let me destroy his reputation in the industry. He lost his job and lived in poverty because of my lies. He never defended himself. He never told the media the truth about my fatal flaw. If he had exposed my mistake, my career would have ended before it even started. He stayed completely silent, protecting my fragile, arrogant reputation while I actively destroyed his life. I was a monster. I hosted a lavish party while my hero was being buried in a cheap, lonely grave. I remembered the roll of paper on his table the night of the fire. I finally understood what it was. I pulled a second envelope from the dusty box. I opened it. It was not Arthur's old, ugly design. It was a heavily modified, incredibly safe version of my backup plan. My father had secretly designed a flawless, reinforced foundation for my backup building. He knew I would need a safe plan after he burned the Swan. He had secretly guided my success from the dark shadows. He was the silent, invisible guardian angel of my entire career. I achieved absolute greatness only because he was willing to stand in the dirt. I cried until my voice was completely gone. But my emotional breakdown was violently interrupted. My office phone rang loudly. It was the lead engineer at the new skyscraper. "Ethan, the pumping didn't work," he shouted in panic. "The cracks are spreading faster. The foundation is shifting. We have a massive, critical emergency." I wiped my face and looked at the blueprint of my current skyscraper on the wall. The horrifying reality hit me again. I had used the exact same curved glass design from the Crystal Swan. The Fatal Flaw was built into my new 60-story tower. Part 8. The Father's Secret. I ran out of my office and drove directly to the old architectural firm where my father used to work. I needed to understand everything about the man I had misunderstood my entire life. The old boss, the man I had manipulated into firing my father, was still there. I walked into his small office. I looked at him with desperate, crying eyes. "Tell me the truth about Arthur," I pleaded. Why was he considered a failure? Why did he never design anything great? The old boss sighed heavily and looked at a dusty picture on his desk. "Arthur was not a failure, Ethan," the old boss said quietly. 30 years ago, he was the brightest, most talented architect in the city. He was a true visionary. But he worked under a very powerful, very proud mentor. The mentor designed a massive, unstable bridge. Arthur found a fatal flaw in the mentor's design, the boss continued. But the mentor refused to listen and built the bridge anyway. During a storm, a section collapsed and 5 people died. The mentor was going to go to prison and lose his entire family. I listened in absolute shock. "Arthur took the blame," the old boss revealed softly. "He altered the documents to make it look like he made the final mathematical error. He saved his mentor's life and career. But Arthur was officially disgraced. He was banned from ever designing major projects again. My father had sacrificed his own brilliant future to save another arrogant man. He spent 30 years drawing cheap houses because he chose mercy over fame. He was not a failure. He was the most honorable, incredible man in the history of the industry. He saved his mentor 30 years ago. And 10 years ago, he sacrificed his remaining dignity to save me. He was a professional shield, absorbing the failures of arrogant men." I thanked the old boss and walked out into the busy street. I felt incredibly small and worthless. My phone rang again. It was the wealthy bank investors who funded my new skyscraper. "Ethan, we heard about the cracks in the foundation," the lead investor said coldly. "We hired an independent engineer. He found your aerodynamic flaw in the curved glass design." My blood froze. "We need to evacuate the building and halt construction immediately," I said urgently. "It is a massive death trap. The building will collapse." I was ready to do the right thing. But the investor's next words completely shocked my naive mind. "No, Ethan. We are not stopping," the investor ordered harshly. "We have invested $1 billion. If we stop, we go bankrupt. The engineer says it might hold up for a few years before it collapses." We will finish the building, sell it quickly, and let someone else take the blame. Part 9. The Impossible Choice. The wealthy investors were completely ruthless. If you halt construction, Ethan, we will sue you for everything you own, the investor threatened. We will expose your fatal flaw to the media. You will lose your license, your money, and your freedom. You will go to prison. Just sign the final safety approval, the investor demanded smoothly. Keep your mouth shut. You will get your massive final payment, and you will remain a famous star. We will hide the cracks behind thick drywall. No one will ever know until it is too late. I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking violently. I was facing the ultimate, impossible choice. I could sign the fake safety papers. I could keep my millions of dollars, my luxury cars, and my flawless reputation. I could remain the golden boy of the city. But if I signed those papers, I would be condemning thousands of innocent people to a terrifying, violent death. The building would eventually collapse. Blood would permanently stain my hands. If I refused to sign, the investors would destroy my life. I would lose absolutely everything. I walked back to my luxury apartment. I looked at the expensive paintings and the expensive furniture. I realized that my entire life was built on a foundation of lies and innocent sacrifices. I looked at the burned blueprint of the Crystal Swan sitting on my table. I finally understood the crushing, agonizing weight my father carried on his shoulders. He had to choose between his own happiness and the safety of others. He chose to destroy himself to do the right thing. He chose to be hated so others could live. I picked up Arthur's old, worn leather notebook. I held it tightly against my chest. The arrogant, selfish boy who walked out of his father's house 10 years ago was finally dead. I knew exactly what I had to do. The decision was terrifying, but it was crystal clear. I drove to the construction site of the giant skyscraper in the middle of the night. I bypassed the security guards and walked down into the dark foundation. I took hundreds of detailed, high-resolution photographs of the massive, spreading cracks in the concrete pillars. I returned to my office and scanned all of my father's mathematical notes proving the fatal flaw. I attached the photos of the cracking foundation. I created a massive, undeniable digital file of evidence. I was holding a bomb that would completely destroy my own empire. I took a deep breath. I typed an email to every major newspaper, television station, and government safety inspector in the country. I attached the evidence file. I did not blame the investors. I took full, absolute responsibility for the fatal, arrogant error. I hit send. Part 10. The Legacy of Ash. The explosion was immediate and absolutely devastating. By sunrise, the news was everywhere. The city government halted the skyscraper construction instantly. The area was evacuated. The media tore my reputation into tiny, bloody pieces. They called me a reckless, arrogant fraud who almost murdered thousands of people. The bank investors sued me, just as they promised. The government seized my luxury apartment, my cars, and all my bank accounts to pay for the massive demolition of the dangerous skyscraper. I was officially bankrupt. My architectural license was permanently revoked. I was completely ruined. I walked out of the courthouse with absolutely nothing. People yelled insults at me in the street. Former friends refused to look at me. I was the most hated man in the city. I was an absolute, monumental failure. And yet, for the first time in my life, I felt completely free. I did not feel angry or bitter. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I had saved thousands of innocent lives. I finally understood the quiet, beautiful strength of my father. I was proud to carry his heavy burden. I was proud to be exactly like him. I took a long bus ride to the edge of the city. I walked through the quiet, green graveyard until I found Arthur's simple, cheap headstone. There were no flowers or grand statues. It was a humble grave for a humble man. I knelt down in the soft dirt. I reached into my old, worn bag. I pulled out the massive, shiny gold Architect of the Year trophy I had won years ago. It was heavy and expensive. I placed the shiny gold trophy directly onto the dirt of his grave. It belonged entirely to him. I finally understand, Dad, I whispered, tears falling gently onto the green grass. True greatness is not about building tall glass towers that touch the clouds. True greatness is having the courage to tear them down in the dark to protect the innocent. I touched the cold stone of his grave. You are the greatest architect who ever lived, I cried softly. You built a shield around my soul, and it held up perfectly. I am so sorry it took me so long to see the truth. I stood up and walked away from the grave. I had no money, no career, and no famous reputation. I was just a failed architect walking in the shadows. But I smiled as I walked down the quiet road. The legacy of Ash was finally washed away by the truth. I was a complete failure in the eyes of the world. But in my heart, I had finally succeeded. I had become my father's true son. The masterpiece was never the building. The masterpiece was the sacrifice. And that is a structure that will never, ever collapse.